He leaned toward his guests and mimicked her voice, the thick Caribbean lilt she'd carried from Kingston to Connecticut. Exaggerated, cruel, performed for laughter. 14 guests at a mahogany dining table that cost more than her car went silent for half a second, then offered the nervous chuckle of people too afraid to object. Josephine Clark stood 3 feet away, holding a silver tray of champagne flutes, her expression perfectly composed. Her hands did not tremble. Her jaw did not clench. She just watched Elliot Hargrove, 59 years old, worth $4.7 billion according to Forbes, perform his imitation one more time. What Elliot Hargrove didn't know, couldn't know because he'd never once asked her a single question, was that Josephine Clark wasn't just the woman who poured his wine. In 48 hours, she would be the woman who owned his house. Rewind 3 years, the first time Josephine Clark drove through the iron gates of Hargrove Manor, she noticed 3 things. The driveway alone was longer than the street she'd grown up on in Kingston. The grounds, 7 acres of manicured hedge and English rose garden, were maintained by a team she'd learned were paid below living wage. And the house itself, a 22-room colonial revival in Greenwich, Connecticut, had been built in 1887 by a man whose name meant nothing to Elliot Hargrove, though it meant everything to Josephine. She'd applied for the domestic supervisor position out of necessity, not ambition. Her mother's dialysis treatments cost $4,200 a month. Her sister's kids needed school fees. The architecture consulting firm she'd built in Kingston over 8 years had collapsed in the recession, like so many others. And Josephine, who held a degree in architectural history from the University of the West Indies and a master's in historic preservation from Columbia University, had found that credentials earned abroad meant considerably less in Greenwich drawing rooms. So she cleaned houses, good houses, and through a placement agency, she'd landed Hargrove Manor. Elliot Hargrove had built his fortune the way men of his generation liked to tell it. From nothing. Son of a Connecticut insurance agent, dropped out of Yale at 22, early moves in tech that turned $100,000 bets into billions. By 40, he was on Forbes. By 50, he was donating wins to museums and buying estate property like other men collected watches. He had a talent for identifying value in things others had overlooked. Distressed assets, undervalued companies, forgotten properties. The cruel irony was that this skill never once extended to the people who maintained his life. Eleanor Hargrove, his wife of 30 years, had died 2 years before Josephine arrived. Ovarian cancer. Quick, brutal. 3 months from diagnosis to funeral. The household staff, who had adored Eleanor and feared Elliot, told Josephine that something had died in him with her. He'd always been difficult. After Eleanor, difficult became something closer to contemptuous. He managed his staff the way he managed declining portfolio assets, with cold efficiency and the absolute conviction that everything around him existed for his use. He never learned Josephine's last name, called her Jo despite being corrected twice, then stopped correcting her name when she realized it cost her more than it cost him. To Elliot Hargrove, domestic staff occupied a specific tier of existence, necessary, replaceable. He spoke about them in front of them the way people speak in front of furniture. Josephine, who had spent 8 years in Kingston advising on the preservation of colonial-era estates, recognized the architecture of that kind of entitlement perfectly. She'd studied it in buildings. She'd now live inside it, what Elliot Hargrove didn't know about his domestic supervisor. She'd been corresponding for 18 months with his estate attorney about a matter he'd never bothered to understand. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, Hargrove hosted what he called small dinners, 14 to 20 guests, catered to the standard of a Michelin 2-star, served by a domestic staff that Josephine coordinated with the precision of a surgical team. Elliot never thanked them. He assessed their work the way a man checks his watch, quickly, impersonally, noting only failure and never excellence. Josephine had developed a system: champagne on arrival at 7:15, hors d'oeuvres by 7:30, starter at 8 o'clock. Between courses, she moved like a shadow through the dining room, replenishing, anticipating, ensuring nothing interrupted the performance Elliot staged for whichever combination of hedge fund managers, local politicians, and cultural figureheads had been assembled that particular evening. She noticed patterns: who drank more in winter than summer, which guests Elliot watched most carefully during business conversations. Which doors he made sure to close before certain names came up. She noticed because noticing was what she'd always done. In buildings, in structures, in the hidden architecture of power. And Hargrove Manor was full of things worth noticing. There was the East Wing, for instance, permanently closed. Elliot told guests it was undergoing restoration. Josephine had tried the door twice in her first month and found it deadbolted. The housekeeping team were forbidden from entering. She'd assumed water damage or storage. But once, working late to prepare for a Wednesday dinner, she'd passed the East Wing at 11 and heard Elliot's voice, low and private, on his phone inside a room that was supposedly sealed. He'd said a name she'd heard before, the attorney's name, Marcus Webb. That was the first incident. The second came 6 weeks later. Josephine was reviewing supply orders when she discovered that the insurance records for the estate, which she'd been asked to cross-reference against contractor invoices, listed the East Wing's renovation at $2.1 million. But in 18 months, not a single contractor had set foot in that wing. She knew because she managed contractor access. Every visit, every invoice, every scheduled repair came across her desk. The $2.1 million appeared to be going somewhere. It wasn't going to the East Wing. The third came on a Thursday afternoon in November, when a courier arrived with a sealed envelope for Elliot, marked confidential, estate matters, and Elliot's reaction was not what she expected. She'd handed him the envelope in his study. He'd held it for a long moment, without opening it, fingers tight on the flap, jaw working. Then he'd looked at her, actually looked at her, which was rare, and said, "Has anyone else handled this?" "No, sir," Josephine said. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth, something harder. Assessment. The way he looked at a property before deciding whether it was worth acquiring. Then he dismissed her without another word and locked his study door. That night, Josephine sent her third email of the year to Marcus Webb. She had found the document 14 months into working at Hargrove Manor, by accident, the way most consequential discoveries happen, through ordinary work and extraordinary proximity to power. She'd been cataloging the library on Elliot's instructions, a full inventory, shelf by shelf, because an insurance adjuster was updating the contents policy on the property. Josephine was methodical, third shelf from the top, east wall bound ledgers. The ledger she pulled wasn't a ledger at all. It was a property deed. Amended, dated 1962. And the name on the original filing, filed in 1889 and amended in 1962 to remove it, was a name Josephine recognized because she'd seen it in a letter her grandmother had kept for 60 years in a tin box in Kingston. Cornelius Clark, her great-great-grandfather. Josephine's hands had gone very still on the desk. She'd read the document 3 times. Then she'd photographed every page, replaced the ledger exactly as she'd found it, finished the catalog, and driven home. She hadn't slept until 3 a.m. By morning, she'd written the longest email of her life to Marcus Webb, Elliot Hargrove's estate attorney, who was also, and this was the part Elliot had never thought to verify, the son of the attorney who had handled the 1962 amendment, and who had, for 15 years, been quietly trying to locate the Clark family's living descendants. Her great-great-grandfather had built the East Wing. Not metaphorically, literally. Cornelius Clark, a Jamaican craftsman who'd come to Connecticut in 1883 as part of a contracted labor crew, had designed and constructed the East Wing's interior, its carved mahogany banisters, its coffered ceilings, its arched plasterwork, under a contract that included a perpetual occupancy clause for his family line. A clause that had never been legally dissolved, only fraudulently obscured in 1962 during a sale between 2 men who'd assumed the Clark family was either unaware or unreachable. Josephine Clark was neither. Remember this detail. It matters in ways even she hadn't yet fully understood. The dinner where Elliot Hargrove mimicked her accent was a Friday in late January. 14 guests, including 2 state senators, a gallery owner from Manhattan, and the chair of a university endowment committee to which Elliot had recently pledged $8 million. The conversation had turned, as it often did at his table, to the question of what Greenwich was losing and what it was gaining. Someone had mentioned the shortage of skilled domestic workers. Elliot had laughed and said, "My supervisor, wonderful woman, comes from Jamaica. You should hear her describe things. He'd done the voice then. Exaggerated vowels, the lilt stretched into caricature. Everything is lovely, lovely. He'd imitated, and the table had offered that strained half-laughter. Josephine had been standing 3 feet away. She absorbed it the way she'd absorbed every small dismissal over 3 years, completely, privately, without visible reaction. That was the armor she'd built, not from weakness but from strategy. A person who shows you her wounds gives you a weapon. A person who shows you nothing makes you wonder what she's holding. What Elliot Hargrove was about to find out. She distributed the champagne. She refreshed the centerpieces. She caught the eye of 2 other staff members who'd witnessed it and gave them the small nod that meant, carry on. It doesn't matter tonight. Then she went to the kitchen, finished coordinating the main course service, and at 9:45, when the dinner party was deep into dessert and Bordeaux, she excused herself to make a phone call to Marcus Webb, who confirmed that the probate court filing, 14 months in preparation, was scheduled for Monday morning. 48 hours later, on a gray Sunday morning when Elliot Hargrove was reviewing architectural plans for a property he'd recently acquired in Westchester, Josephine Clark arrived at Hargrove Manor not in her domestic supervisor's uniform, but in a charcoal wool coat, a briefcase in one hand and Marcus Webb at her side. The housekeeper who answered the door, young, newer, unfamiliar with the procedural weight of a briefcase and an estate attorney, brought them to the study without quite understanding what she was escorting. Elliot looked up. He saw Josephine. He saw the lawyer. He saw the briefcase. His expression shifted through several registers in less than 2 seconds. Recognition, confusion, and something at the edges that might, in a more self-aware man, have been the first tremor of alarm. "What is this?" he said. "Good morning, Mr. Hargrove," Marcus Webb said, setting documents on the desk. "I represent Josephine Clark in a matter regarding the estate of Hargrove Manor, specifically regarding the Cornelius Clark occupancy covenant, originally executed in 1889 and fraudulently obscured in 1962. We have a probate court filing scheduled for Monday, and I wanted to extend the courtesy of informing you today, before the press does." Elliot Hargrove's hand tightened on his pen. His jaw set. His eyes went to Josephine with an expression she'd seen aimed at employees he was about to fire, contractors who'd missed a deadline, anyone who'd had the audacity to place an obstacle in his path. "I don't know what you think you've found, but I found it in your own library," Josephine said. Her voice was perfectly calm. "Shelf 3, east wall, 3rd from the top, the original deed and the fraudulent 1962 amendment. Your predecessor's legal team tried to remove my family from the record. They didn't destroy it. They just filed it away and hoped no one would look. That document has no legal standing. The court will determine that," Marcus Webb said. "But I'll tell you what we have. The original 1889 contract signed by the previous owner and by Cornelius Clark, a perpetual occupancy covenant covering the East Wing, non-transferable except by legal dissolution of the Clark family line. The 1962 amendment, which was executed without notification to or representation for the Clark family, a direct violation of Connecticut property law as it stood at the time. Josephine Clark is the last living direct descendant. The covenant under our argument has never been legally dissolved. It still stands." The pen in Elliot's hand went still. "You can fight it," Josephine said. "You have the resources to drag this through courts for years. I know that. But I'm offering you something different. A settlement. Before Monday. Before the filings become public record. Before the journalists who cover your philanthropy start asking why a man who just pledged $8 million to a university endowment is fighting a descendant's legal right to her ancestors' work in court. Before the university starts asking the same question." Elliot Hargrove's face was the color of the January sky outside his window. "You've been here 3 years," he said. It came out almost like an accusation. "Yes," Josephine said. "I found the document in month 14. I spent the next 20 months verifying it, securing legal representation, and confirming the chain of descent. I didn't rush. I wanted to be sure." "I was sure." A long silence fell over the study, the kind that fills up rooms when men who've never been outmaneuvered are forced to understand that they have been. But here's where it gets interesting. Elliot Hargrove didn't call his lawyers to fight. He didn't stand up and demand they leave. He sat with it, the document, the argument, The quiet weight of 3 years of underestimating the woman who'd kept his house, and something happened behind his eyes that Marcus Webb would later describe as a man recalculating everything he thought he understood. The East Wing, Elliot said finally. The East Wing, Josephine confirmed. Your insurance listed a $2.1 million renovation that never happened. I'd like to know where that money went. But that's a separate matter. Today's discussion is about my family's covenant. At Marcus Webb. At Josephine Clark, who had spent 3 years pouring his wine. Invisible, meticulous, utterly underestimated. His expression moved through something complicated, and to his partial credit, what settled on his face wasn't pure anger. It was something quieter. A man who'd built his fortune on recognizing value in overlooked things, confronting the full cost of having failed to do that with a person. What are the settlement terms? He asked. The probate filing never happened. By Monday afternoon, both parties' attorneys had drafted an agreement. The East Wing, valued independently at $3.8 million given its historic architectural features, was formally recognized under the Cartnet as falling under the Clark family's perpetual right of occupancy. A trust was established in Josephine Clark's name. Elliot Hargrove, to the surprise of Marcus Webb, who'd expected litigation, agreed to terms within 62 hours of that Sunday morning meeting. The $2.1 million insurance discrepancy, which Josephine had flagged as a separate matter, turned out to involve a contractor billing scheme his previous estate manager had been running for 4 years. That manager had been let go a month before Josephine arrived. The investigation that followed recovered $1.4 million and resulted in a civil suit that Elliot won. It was not lost on anyone paying attention that the discrepancy had been caught by the woman who managed the contractor access logs. The woman Elliot had never asked a substantive question in 3 years of her employment. Within a week, the story moved through Greenwich the way only quiet, devastating stories do. Passed at dinner parties, relayed between attorneys, shared in the particular low voice people use for things that are simultaneously astonishing and entirely logical in retrospect. The domestic supervisor, the architect's descendant, the deed in the library, 14 months of documentation. The Friday dinner where Elliot Hargrove had mimicked her accent in front of 14 witnesses 48 hours before she walked in with a briefcase. That detail specifically had a way of silencing rooms. 14 months later, Josephine Clark stood in the East Wing of Hargrove Manor, her family's wing now formally recognized as such, overseeing its actual restoration, a proper one this time, documented and contracted. She'd brought in a preservation team she'd worked with in Kingston, craftsmen who understood how to restore 19th century coffered plasterwork and carved mahogany banisters without erasing what made them singular. She walked through the scaffolding the way she'd once walked through buildings she'd been hired to save, with attention, with care, with the particular reverence of someone who understands that what survives long enough becomes irreplaceable. Elliot Hargrove had not become a different man, that was the honest truth, and Josephine had no interest in the story that required him to be transformed. He remained exacting, unsentimental, difficult to work for. What he had done was renegotiate, with himself, she suspected, what it cost to underestimate people. She still consulted on the estate. Different terms, different title, the kind of professional relationship that acknowledged what she actually brought to it. He called her Miss Clark now, not Joe. He'd asked her once stiffly whether she'd always known about the document when she applied. She'd told him the truth. She hadn't. She'd found it while doing the job he'd hired her to do. He hadn't said anything for a long moment. Then, "You're thorough." "It's what you hired me for," she said. She'd left it there. Her mother's dialysis was covered now, and then some. Her sister's kids had their school fees. The architecture consulting work had found her again, quietly, through referrals the way it always does when a story starts circulating in the right rooms. She was not wealthy in the way Elliot Hargrove was wealthy. She didn't need to be. On a Tuesday in March, she stood at the East Wing's arched window, the one Cornelius Clark had framed with plasterwork so precise that it outlasted 130 years of neglect, and looked out at the grounds in the early gray morning, the hedge, the rose garden, dormant now waiting for spring. The long driveway that had seemed so imposing the first time she'd driven through those gates. She thought about her grandmother's tin box, the letter inside it that had mentioned, only once, a great-great-grandfather who'd built something beautiful in Connecticut and had been erased from it. Her grandmother had kept it not as evidence, not as grievance, just as memory, as proof that something had been real, even when the record said otherwise. What Josephine had done was restore the record. That, more than the legal covenant, more than the trust, more than the look on Elliot Hargrove's face on that January Sunday morning, was what mattered. The work had been real, the man who made it had been real, and now the building, standing in the gray March light, knew his name again. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.